Hey guys, tonight we slip into a place you've probably imagined but never really thought about. The royal bedroom. Picture velvet curtains so heavy they muffle sound like a padded recording studio, golden tassels swinging gently with each draft from the stone corridor, and guards in polished boots waiting just outside the door. You might think of this space as private, as sacred, as somewhere only a king and queen reclined in peace. But if you picture that, you'd be completely wrong. The royal bedchamber wasn't just for sleep. It was a political stage, an architectural display of wealth, and at times a courtroom, a gossip hall, and a waiting room for power itself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from, whether it's just after lunch in Chicago or just before bed in Melbourne. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey and together. You slip through the imagined corridors of a medieval palace, torchlight flickering along damp stone walls. The door creaks open and inside a royal bedroom glows with the warmth of candle stubs. Heavy drapes fall from the canopy bed like a theatre curtain, and you realize this room is as much stage as sanctuary. Every textile screams power, damask curtains embroidered with gold thread, imported carpets muffling footsteps, tapestries depicting epic hunts or biblical scenes. These weren't just decorations, they were political billboards stitched in silk. The irony? While all this grandeur suggested luxury, many royal bedrooms were drafty, cold, and crowded. Servants shuffled in and out, chamberlains recorded who came to visit, and courtiers occasionally stood witness to bedtime routines. Privacy, the thing you crave after a long day, was a rare luxury even kings couldn't fully command. Imagine trying to fall asleep while 3 attendants stand at the edge of your mattress waiting for you to snore. Awkward, right? But there was method in this madness. The bedchamber was a place of access. If you could get close enough to see the monarch tucked into bed, you were in the inner circle. In France, especially at Versailles, the ritual of the coucher, the king's going-to-bed ceremony, was attended like a Broadway show. High-ranking nobles jostled for a position just to watch Louis XIV change into his nightshirt. It sounds ridiculous, but to be admitted into that velvet-curtained room was to bask in the glow of royal favour. Miss the ceremony and you risked being forgotten. Beds themselves weren't just furniture, they were thrones after dark. A monarch receiving ambassadors while propped up against embroidered pillows wasn't unusual. Henry VIII, in fact, sometimes held audiences from his bed, greeting envoys while wrapped in sheets. Imagine your boss calling a Monday meeting but insisting everyone crowd around his mattress. Strange, but historically accurate. And of course, the royal bedroom also carried undertones of vulnerability. To sleep was to expose yourself, literally horizontal, defenseless. No wonder so many kings surrounded themselves with elaborate locks, hidden passageways, and loyal guards at their door. Historians still argue whether these security measures were more practical or theatrical. After all, what assassin wants to tiptoe across creaky parquet floors past 10 servants and 2 dogs just to reach a king? But the paranoia was real, and the symbolism even more so. Let's not forget the sheer spectacle of the bed itself. In Tudor England, a royal bed could be large enough to fit 6 people, not because they all slept there, but because size meant status. Some mattresses were stuffed with wool, some with feathers, and some with exotic fillers like swan's down. Delicate but impractical, a bit like ordering caviar when all you want is toast. A quirky tidbit? Some queens reportedly had mattresses laced with herbs like lavender or rosemary, thought to ward off illness or bad dreams. Whether it worked or just made the whole room smell like a medieval bathhouse, well, that's another debate. And yet, amid this theatre of velvet and ceremony, human quirks crept in. Kings snored, queens tossed and turned, and servants probably rolled their eyes behind those grand curtains. The bedroom was paradoxical, intimate yet public, sacred yet political. a place where dynasties were secured, or undone, under embroidered sheets. You lie there, imagining yourself slipping into that canopy bed, velvet curtains swaying slightly with your breath, the faint smell of wax, perfume, and damp stone mixing into the night air. It feels grand, but also strangely claustrophobic. You realize the royal bedroom was less a retreat and more a stage where history whispered itself into being, one candle-lit night at a time. You might assume the king's chamber closed like a vault once the curtains were drawn, locking him away from the world until morning. But the truth is, he never really slept alone. Even in the most opulent of palaces, solitude was a luxury few monarchs were granted. The idea of a king snoozing peacefully with no one around is more fantasy than fact. Instead, his nights were filled with the quiet shuffling of attendants, the occasional cough of a guard, and the creak of floorboards as servants went about their strange midnight duties. Picture it. You're lying there, finally ready to sink into feather-stuffed pillows, but just a few steps away sits a trusted valet perched on a stool, drowsily watching over you. He doesn't leave. He doesn't even pretend to. He's there in case you sneeze, wake suddenly, or, more ominously, stop breathing. Royal bodies were too important to be left unsupervised. Sometimes entire entourages remained close at hand. In Versailles, Louis XIV's chamber was lined with courtiers who rotated through the night, some sleeping on benches, others awake in case His Majesty needed a glass of water. It sounds exhausting, right? You think you wouldn't survive a single night under those conditions. Try sleeping while someone hovers in the corner like a silent nightlight that occasionally clears its throat. Yet for kings, it was routine. Guards were stationed just outside, often within earshot. In Tudor England, yeomen of the guard camped directly in the royal apartments, sleeping lightly, ready to spring up at the faintest disturbance. It gave the king a sense of safety, though whether it actually protected him or just reminded him of how vulnerable he was is still debated. But attendants weren't just there for protection. Their presence signaled intimacy and status. If you were chosen to spend the night near the royal bed, it wasn't because you snored the quietest, it was because you were trusted. Access to the sleeping king was a badge of honor, and those moments in dim candlelight sometimes allowed whispered favors or subtle influence. Picture slipping a request into conversation while the monarch rubbed his eyes and mumbled, "Fine, fine, tomorrow." That's politics by pillow. There were practical matters too. Medieval kings rarely undressed themselves. Chamberlains helped remove heavy robes, presented nightshirts, and even assisted with washing. If a monarch awoke in the night, needing wine, water, or, let's be blunt, the chamber pot, servants were there, immediately. No midnight fridge raids for these guys. The king was the fridge, and everything was brought to him. Some monarchs even had guards stationed inside the room, weapons at the ready. Charles I of England slept under the watch of gentlemen-at-arms, a kind of royal sleepover squad. It might sound cozy until you remember these weren't friends sharing a bag of chips. They were armored men standing silently in the dark, swords glinting in the candlelight. A bit intimidating if you just want to roll over and snore. One quirky detail. In some courts, the king's bed was shared not with his queen, but with favoured courtiers. Not romantically, though that did happen too, but as a symbol of trust. Sharing a bed was the ultimate intimacy in a time when beds were scarce and warmth was shared. Even among commoners, bed-sharing was normal. For a king, allowing someone to crawl under the covers was a way of saying, "I trust you with my life while I sleep." Historians still argue whether this practice was more about security, companionship, or sheer convenience. Of course, queens faced similar conditions. They too were rarely alone. Ladies-in-waiting slept nearby, sometimes in the same room, sometimes on pallets at the foot of the bed. For royal women, this was both protection and surveillance. Imagine trying to whisper secrets to your lover while your best friend turned spy is literally snoring on the rug beside you. Privacy was a myth. And let's not forget the soundscape of a royal night. Aside from snoring and shuffling, there were guards calling shifts outside, bells ringing the hours, and the occasional clatter of someone dropping a metal jug in the hallway. Sleep in a palace was less about peace and more about endurance. Yet for all its intrusions, the royal bedroom remained a site of immense power. Those attendants who lingered in the dark were witnesses to vulnerability, and that gave them leverage. A single careless remark overheard, a cough that revealed illness, a half-dreamed order muttered into the night, all could ripple outward into court politics by dawn. The king never slept alone because his body and his bed were never fully his own. And so as you imagine yourself pulling the covers higher, remember that solitude is a modern privilege. In the royal bedroom, every breath was shared, every snore recorded, every dream shadowed by others waiting, watching, listening. You might long for silence, but kings and queens never truly found it. Ever wondered what a royal mattress actually felt like beneath all those velvet sheets? You might picture something impossibly soft, like drifting into a marshmallow cloud, but the truth is, royal beds were more complicated and sometimes more uncomfortable than you'd expect. Monarchs had the money to sleep on the best, but best in the Middle Ages and Renaissance often meant expensive, not necessarily good for your back. Take the basic structure, a massive wooden frame, sometimes carved so ornately it looked like a cathedral collapsed into a bedpost. Onto that, they stretched cords or ropes in a crisscross lattice. That was your box spring. Over time, those ropes sagged, so servants had to tighten them constantly, literally giving us the phrase, sleep tight. Imagine drifting off and hearing a rope snap beneath you, hardly majestic. As for the mattress itself, that's where the story gets strange. The poor slept on straw, or hay, stuffed into rough linen sacks, royals upgraded to wool, feathers, or, for the truly extravagant, swan's down. Yes, plucking the softest feathers from swans to stuff a mattress was a thing. It sounds lovely, but historians still argue whether it was actually comfortable or more like trying to sleep on a giant bird puff. Feathers shift, clump, and poke. One sneeze in the middle of the night, and you'd think a goose exploded under the covers. And it wasn't just feathers. Some royal mattresses were laced with dried herbs, lavender, chamomile, rosemary, not just for fragrance but for superstition. People believed certain plants could ward off nightmares or disease. You could call it the medieval version of a scented candle, except instead of flicking a wick, you were basically lying on an entire garden. The downside? Bugs. Yes, insects found those mattresses as irresistible as monarchs did. Servants were forever beating, shaking, and sun-drying bedding to drive out unwanted critters. Even the king's mattress was a battleground against lice. Not exactly the fairy tale image. And pillows? They weren't always standard. Some kings liked mountains of them, others preferred hard bolsters. Henry VIII was reportedly fond of surrounding himself with enormous padded cushions, perhaps to make up for his aching joints. One quirky tidbit: some pillows were stuffed with pea shucks or rushes which crunched softly when you moved. Imagine ASMR crackling under your head all night long, relaxing for some, maddening for others. Let's not forget blankets. In cold northern castles, layers were everything. Furs, ermine, sable, or even bear hides were draped over the bed to trap heat. Royal beds could weigh a ton once fully dressed, with sheet after sheet stacked on top like some medieval lasagna. And unlike your fitted sheet that clings politely to the corners, these linens had to be tucked, smoothed, and folded by a team of servants each morning. The daily bed-making was a performance as ritualized as the king's breakfast. The mattress wasn't just for sleeping either, it was symbolic. During state occasions, a royal bed might be carried from palace to palace, disassembled and reassembled like some travelling circus act. In France, the king's official bed at Versailles was so monumental it was treated almost like a throne. Visitors bowed before it even if he wasn't inside. You're bowing to a piece of furniture, yes, but in that world the bed was the body of the king, a stand-in for royal presence itself. Of course, not every monarch loved their fancy feather-stuffed palaces of sleep. Some preferred simplicity. Elizabeth I, though surrounded by gilded furnishings, sometimes favoured modest bedding arrangements. Others, like Louis XIV, adored sleeping high above the world, in grand beds raised on platforms. Was it practical? Not really. But when you're the Sun King, even gravity bends to your ego. And yet the fragility of these mattresses told another story. They needed constant maintenance. Servants had to shake feathers back into place, smooth lumps and beat out dust. In some cases, entire teams were assigned just to fluff the royal bedding. If you've ever complained about making your bed in the morning, imagine needing 4 people to hold the corners while another tightened ropes and a 6th arranged lavender sachets like they were setting up an altar. So as you picture yourself lying back, sinking into centuries-old swan's down, remember it wasn't all softness and luxury. Sometimes those mattresses were prickly, sometimes they smelled odd, sometimes they were crawling with life. The royal bed was a marvel of display, but whether the king actually got a good night's sleep on it, well, historians still argue about that. You'd think sheets are just sheets, plain fabric, tucked in neatly, forgotten the moment you drift off. But in royal bedrooms, linens carried meanings that stretched far beyond comfort. They were woven symbols, stage props in the theatre of monarchy, and sometimes bargaining chips in the silent diplomacy of marriage and alliance. You slide into the fabric not just to rest, but to broadcast wealth, legitimacy, and even morality. Royal sheets weren't the cotton blends you toss in the washer today. Linen was the standard, spun from flax fibers that required enormous amounts of labor. The whiter and smoother the linen, the more expensive it was, and the king's bed always gleamed with that snowy brilliance. For centuries, whiteness wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about purity, about being untarnished. A royal bed glowing with pristine sheets whispered a message. Here lies order, virtue, and divine favor. That was the theory anyway. In reality, those sheets soaked up sweat, wine, and candle wax stains faster than any laundress could keep up with. And laundry wasn't simple. Palaces often employed entire teams dedicated to washing and pressing royal sheets, folding them with almost religious precision. Some laundresses actually had their own rank within court hierarchies. Imagine your boss assigning someone to polish your pillowcase because it reflected on the company's reputation. That was the logic of kings. Layers mattered too. Beds weren't made with just one sheet. There were often multiple stacked layers, a bottom sheet stretched over the mattress ropes, a middle sheet, then another to separate the sleeper from blankets and furs. A king might be cocooned in 4 or 5 layers of cloth before he even reached the covers. Each fold was arranged ceremonially, like the draping of a holy relic. It sounds excessive, but for royals, sheets doubled as a kind of stage curtain. When witnesses attended royal consummations, yes, that happened, sheets were the thin fabric between public spectacle and private act. Historians still argue whether this ritual proof of bedding was more about legal necessity or theatrical humiliation. Patterns and embroidery carried weight too. Monarchs flaunted sheets laced with gold thread, stitched with coats of arms, or perfumed with sachets tucked into hems. Some were gifts from foreign rulers, meant to remind couples of treaties literally sealed in bed. For example, when Catherine of Aragon came to England, her trousseau included linens so fine they dazzled the Tudor court. These weren't just fabrics, they were status symbols as loud as crown jewels. There's even a quirky tidbit about sheet rotation. In some courts, certain sets were reserved for holy days, while others were meant for ordinary nights. Imagine a royal chamberlain pulling out the Easter sheets, the way you dig out holiday decorations. One queen supposedly had sheets embroidered with biblical verses, so every night's sleep doubled as a sermon on fabric. That might be inspirational, or a bit like sleeping on a motivational poster. But linens also carried anxiety. Poisoning was a real fear, and it wasn't just about wine goblets. People believed toxins could be rubbed into fabric, absorbed through skin. Servants boiled sheets in vinegar to cleanse them, and some kings demanded fresh linens nightly to lower the risk. Ironically, frequent laundering actually wore the fabric thin, so the same sheets that displayed purity also frayed at the edges, royalty literally wearing their power threadbare. And then there were the smells. Palaces weren't known for breezy hygiene, so perfumed water and herbs were sprinkled on linens before bed. Rosewater, orange blossom, or crushed lavender turned sheets into a giant sachet. Sometimes, though, the effect was less spa retreat and more over-enthusiastic potpourri attack. Imagine dozing off while your bed reeks like a bouquet that died 3 days ago. Comfort wasn't always the point, appearance was. The symbolism of sheets went further still. In royal imagery, a canopy bed framed with glowing linens represented dynastic continuity. New heirs were conceived there, treaties were symbolically consummated there, and sometimes even bodies were laid out for display beneath those same embroidered sheets. In the royal world, fabric was never just fabric. So as you imagine yourself slipping between cold, crisp linen in some echoing palace, remember you're not just lying in cloth, you're wrapped in politics, purity and superstition. Every crease carries weight, every fold whispers a message, and every wash cycle is a tiny act of diplomacy. And while you stretch under your own plain sheets tonight, be glad no one's judging your virtue or legitimacy based on how neatly you folded them this morning. You've probably never thought twice about your pillow, just a soft square that either supports your neck or somehow betrays you by flattening overnight. But in a royal bedroom, pillows weren't merely cushions, they were luxuries, perfumes, and sometimes suspicious little sachets of mystery powders. You lean back into one, and suddenly you're inhaling not just comfort, but the politics and paranoia of court life. Royal pillows were often stuffed with the same fillers as mattresses, feathers, wool, even dried herbs. Goose feathers were common, swan's down was prized, and occasionally exotic bird feathers made an appearance. The fluffier the pillow, the richer the owner. But here's the catch, they weren't always comfortable. Feathers clumped, quills poked through fabric, and restless monarchs often woke up with stiff necks despite the extravagance. Even kings could grumble, "This blasted thing feels like sleeping on a hedgehog." But pillows weren't just about softness, they were about scent. Servants sprinkled powders or tucked perfume sachets inside the seams. Rose petals, lavender, rosemary, even crushed cloves were used to mask the less-than-regal odors of medieval life. Imagine falling asleep in a room filled with candle smoke, damp stone, and the occasional waft of chamber pot. Perfumed pillows were less indulgence than survival. Of course, not everyone agreed on the balance. Some monarchs adored heavily perfumed bedding, others found it suffocating. Historians still argue whether Queen Elizabeth II's preference leaned toward subtle rosewater or overpowering spice blends. Then there were the suspicious powders, substances that might make you drowsy or worse. Because assassination by poison was a constant fear, pillows were sometimes suspected of being tampered with. A pinch of powder dusted inside could, in theory, send a king to eternal sleep. That paranoia led to rituals of checking, shaking, and sniffing pillows each night. Imagine being the servant assigned to pillow patrol, awkwardly squeezing royal cushions in front of a half-undressed monarch. One quirky tidbit: some nobles insisted on their pillows being boiled in vinegar before use, a medieval attempt at detox. Pillows also held symbolic roles. In certain courts, ceremonial pillows bore embroidered crests, laid on beds to showcase dynastic power. Some even doubled as thrones in miniature. For coronations or funerals, lavishly decorated pillows supported crowns or holy relics, blending the intimacy of the bedroom with the theatre of state. The humble pillow carried surprising weight, both literally and politically. And let's not ignore the quirks of nighttime habit. Some monarchs couldn't sleep without multiple pillows stacked high. Henry VIII, with his bulk and ailments, often surrounded himself with a veritable fortress of cushions, like a child refusing to give up stuffed animals. Others preferred firmness, almost ascetic in taste. Frederick the Great supposedly favoured a single thin bolster, dismissing softness as weakness. Even in bed, personality leaked through. There's also the comedy of the royal pillow fight, not in the playful sense you imagine, but in the struggle among courtiers to supply or arrange them. Servants argued over who had the right to place the king's pillow, because touching the bedding was a privilege linked to court hierarchy. You think your office politics are bad? Try watching two noblemen nearly duel over the honour of fluffing a cushion. Pillows even entered medical theory. Physicians believed certain herbs tucked inside could cure headaches, soothe coughs, or prevent nightmares. One recipe called for stuffing pillows with hops to induce drowsiness, a medieval melatonin gummy if you like. Another involved wormwood, though lying on a pillow of bitter plants probably smelled like a compost heap. Did they work? Hard to say. Historians still debate whether these remedies offered real relief or just gave doctors an excuse to bill extra. So, as you imagine sinking into a royal pillow perfumed with roses but maybe hiding a pinch of paranoia, remember it wasn't simply about rest. It was about prestige, ritual, and the constant tug-of-war between comfort and suspicion. Your head pressed down not just on feathers, but on centuries of tradition and tension, and if the quills poked through, well, even kings sometimes lost sleep over the little things. You know the cliché, the king and queen slept together every night, happily ever after. Forget it. The royal bed was never just about intimacy, it was a performance. Sometimes it was genuine companionship, sometimes forced obligation, and very often a staged political theatre where everyone, from the lowliest valet to the highest duke, cared deeply about who slid under those embroidered sheets. Picture the scene, velvet curtains tied back, courtiers crammed into the chamber, all eyes fixed on the royal couple preparing for bed. In France, under the Bourbons, this was the caucheur, the ritual of putting the king to sleep. Nobles competed for the privilege of handing His Majesty his nightshirt, a chore that today would barely get a teenager out of bed. But at Versailles, it was an honour that could make or break a career. Imagine the absurdity, two dukes glaring daggers at each other, arguing over who gets to pass Louis XIV a clean undershirt. Meanwhile, the king is standing there in his slippers, yawning. The shared royal bed was more than a mattress, it was a symbol of unity. In arranged marriages, especially those cementing alliances, people wanted proof that the union was, well, working. Witnesses were sometimes present for the ceremonial bedding on the wedding night. Curtains might be drawn, but attendants stayed nearby, documenting the moment. A legal marriage wasn't complete until it was consummated, and the bedchamber doubled as a courtroom of flesh and linen. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were invasive necessity or public humiliation. Either way, there was no escaping the pressure. And once the ceremony ended, the ongoing expectation remained. Royals were expected to be seen sleeping together, even if affection was lacking. Some kings dutifully appeared in bed with their queens in the evening, only to sneak away to another chamber later that night. Courtiers knew, of course, they always knew. But the performance mattered. The show of togetherness reassured subjects and foreign envoys that the marriage bond was intact. Think of it as a very awkward PR campaign, staged nightly beneath a canopy of silk. Sometimes the bed was more crowded than you'd expect. In certain courts, young noblemen or ladies-in-waiting slept nearby, not just for service, but as living witnesses to royal virtue. Imagine trying to drift off while a teenager dozes on a pallet 3 feet away, tasked with reporting whether you and your spouse really looked cozy. Privacy, in the modern sense, was a fantasy. The royal bedchamber was an echo chamber of whispers, judgments, and political implications. And yet there were moments when this theatre became absurdly intimate. Take Henry VIII, famously restless in love and marriage. He used his bed not only as a space for queens, but also for mistresses, turning private indulgence into public scandal. The irony? The same courtiers who dutifully attended his nightly rituals were often the very people gossiping about what went on after the curtains were closed. The bed, instead of hiding secrets, became a furnace of rumours. Then there's the curious practice of bed of state. In some palaces, one bed was meant for show while another was for actual sleeping. Visitors would see the official bed draped in golden fabric like a throne on 4 legs. But the monarch might actually retire to a smaller, less impressive bed tucked in a side chamber. The staged bed was political theatre, while the real bed was practical life. Though even there, servants hovered and rituals persisted. A quirky tidbit. In some regions, royal bed-sharing ceremonies involved the entire court trailing into the chamber, singing, blessing, and even tossing sweetmeats onto the bed as good luck charms. Imagine trying to sweep up crushed almonds from your sheets before settling down for the night. Romantic? Maybe not. Memorable? Definitely. So the next time you imagine a king and queen drifting peacefully into slumber, remember the truth. Their bed was crowded with expectations, rituals, and curious eyes. Sharing a bed wasn't just about companionship. It was about proving dynasties, performing stability, and putting on a nightly show where even the act of lying down carried political weight. And as you tug the covers up to your chin tonight, you can be grateful no one's scribbling notes about how convincingly you cuddle. You tug at the heavy curtains draped around the royal bed, and they close with a swish that muffles the world outside. For a moment, it feels like you've stepped into a private cocoon. But don't be fooled. Those curtains weren't just for blocking drafts or keeping light out. They were also tools for secrecy, stage sets for whispers, and barriers that hid as much as they revealed. In a royal bedroom, curtains were power. Royal beds were enormous, and so were their canopies. 4 towering posts held aloft carved frames from which cascaded silks, velvets, or brocades. The richer the fabric, the louder the message. This dynasty is thriving. But when those curtains were drawn tight, they created an inner world where the monarch could finally pretend at privacy. Pretend because everyone knew servants still lingered outside, listening for the faintest stir. Still inside those swaying folds, kings and queens could talk, scheme, or simply breathe without immediate eyes upon them. Curtains were practical too. Castles were draughty. Winds whistled through stone corridors. Without heavy drapes, even the grandest bedchamber turned into an icebox. Imagine sleeping in December while icy air snakes across the floor. You'd pull those curtains closed with gratitude. Some were lined with fur or layered so thick they absorbed candle smoke. They were insulation as much as decoration, turning the bed into a miniature house within the palace. But secrecy was their most powerful role. A drawn curtain could signal intimacy, an affair hidden from prying eyes. It could also signal politics. Ambassadors knew if they were received by a king behind parted curtains, they were inside the circle of favour. To be left outside staring at drawn fabric was a subtle humiliation. The royal bed wasn't just a place to lie down, it was a throne behind cloth walls. There's a quirky tidbit here. In some courts, curtains were embroidered not just with flowers or vines, but with allegories, scenes of loyalty, virtue, even biblical battles. Imagine whispering to your lover under the watchful eye of stitched angels frowning disapprovingly from above. Cozy, but also a little judgmental. Historians still argue whether these embroidered moral scenes were chosen to inspire good behavior or simply to show off the weaver's skill. Either way, they must have made for some awkward midnight glances. Curtains also muffled sound, but not completely. Servants waiting just beyond sometimes caught fragments of speech, enough to feed the gossip mills. A misplaced phrase could become tomorrow's court scandal. That's the paradox of those curtains. They promised secrecy, but delivered only shadows and muffled hints, tempting imaginations to run wild. Think of them as the original gossip filters, everything half-heard, never certain, always tantalizing. And when morning came, the opening of curtains was itself a ritual. Servants swept in, cords were tied back, light streamed into the bedchamber. The royal body, once hidden, was revealed again to the business of ruling. The curtains became stage wings, pulled aside for the next act. Sometimes, though, curtains betrayed secrets. Tales survive of royal mistresses slipping behind fabric in hopes of going unnoticed, only to be discovered when someone tugged at the cords too early. One French duke famously described a bedchamber curtain as a veil too thin for discretion. He wasn't wrong. So as you pull your own blanket tonight, imagine it growing higher, heavier, thick with embroidery and secrecy. On one side, the murmurs of servants and the creak of polished boots. On the other, your small bubble of shadow. For a king or queen, that space between curtain and sheet was the closest thing to privacy they would ever know. A whispering cocoon, fragile as silk, where power and secrecy tangled with sleep. You roll onto your side, and for a moment the flicker of torchlight plays across the canopy above. Royal bedrooms were never truly dark. Fire was the only way to chase away shadows, and in palaces filled with stone walls and endless corridors, the choice of light mattered almost as much as the bed itself. Candlelight and torchlight weren't just practical, they set the entire mood of the night. Imagine rows of candles balanced on iron sconces, wax dripping down like slow tears, their flames wobbling every time a servant shuffled past. The glow was golden, soft, flattering on silk sheets and polished jewels, but smoky. Too smoky. By midnight, the chamber air could feel thick, heavy, like trying to breathe inside a bakery oven. In grander rooms, braziers burned with fragrant woods, or even resin to add a sweet note. Sometimes, though, the effect was more choking than charming. Historians still argue whether royals tolerated this because they genuinely enjoyed the glow, or because candlelight was a public display of wealth. The more you burned, the richer you looked. Torches were brighter but less elegant. Their hiss and crackle filled the silence, and their smoke curled into rafters, blackening ceilings. Guards in outer chambers relied on torches more than kings did, since no monarch wanted to fall asleep under what was essentially a flaming stick mounted near fabric curtains. You probably wouldn't survive that insurance claim. Still, they gave rooms a dramatic look, an amber haze, shadows stretching tall across walls like looming giants. Some monarchs preferred lanterns with coloured glass panes, tinting the room in red or green. That sounds festive, almost like medieval mood lighting. Others insisted on massive chandeliers suspended above the bed, dripping with dozens of candles. Picture lying beneath that, staring up at a swaying bundle of fire and wax. Relaxing? Not exactly. And then there's the practical question. How do you put all those candles out? Servants had long snuffers, metal cones on sticks used to pinch flames one by one. The nightly extinguishing ritual took time, and sometimes only a few candles were left burning through the night. A strange comfort, perhaps, just enough light to keep nightmares at bay. It's not unlike leaving your bathroom light on because you're convinced the hallway looks suspicious in the dark. Monarchs did the same thing, just with beeswax and servants. Of course, firelight wasn't only for ambience, it was also a signal. A glowing chamber announced that the monarch was awake, available for midnight council, or, depending on who noticed, for more private company. A darkened chamber, by contrast, was a subtle "do not disturb." Everyone in court learned to read the flicker of flames as social cues. One quirky tidbit: some kings had elaborate candle budgets, carefully calculated to show extravagance without overspending. In one account, Henry VIII's bedchamber reportedly consumed so much wax it rivaled the chapel's altar. The symbolism was deliberate. After all, if your king burned more light than God, surely he shone brighter in your world. Yet for all the gilded glow, fire was a constant hazard. Curtains caught, tapestries smouldered, sheets singed. Accidents happened more often than you'd think. One late medieval chronicler even recorded a noble's chamber going up in flames after an unattended candle toppled onto bedding. Picture the chaos: courtiers stumbling in nightshirts, guards splashing wine onto smouldering sheets because water was nowhere handy. Palaces feared fire more than assassins. So you lie there, imagining the royal bedroom flickering in golden haze, the smell of beeswax, the smoky tang on your tongue, the shadows bending and swaying on embroidered walls, comforting and claustrophobic all at once. For a king or queen, the night was never truly dark, but never truly restful either. In the glow of candlelight, the bed became not just a place of sleep, but a stage bathed in fire and shadow, where power hummed even as eyelids drooped. You wouldn't think snoring could be a matter of state, but in royal bedrooms, even the simple act of breathing at night became political, or at least memorable enough to be written about. Imagine it: you're the monarch, ruler of nations, draped in brocade sheets, and yet your legacy includes the fact that you kept half the palace awake with your thunderous nasal symphony. Snoring kings were not unusual. Henry VIII, for example, was said to rumble so loudly that attendants joked they could track his sleep cycles from the corridor. Physicians tried to explain it away. too much meat, too much wine, too much everything, but the sound carried through velvet curtains and echoed down stone hallways. You can picture courtiers nudging each other, whispering, "Ah, the king's asleep at last," not because the palace grew quiet, but because the walls themselves began to vibrate. Queens weren't immune either. Though chroniclers were more discreet, records hint at sleepless nights spent beside spouses who tossed and muttered. Catherine de' Medici supposedly suffered insomnia, pacing instead of resting, while Mary, Queen of Scots, was described as restless, often sighing heavily through the night. For ladies-in-waiting curled on pallets at the foot of the bed, this meant a chorus of creaks, snores, and sighs in the wee hours. You think your roommate's bad? Try sharing space with royalty and their entourage. Of course, medieval and early modern medicine had cures. Some physicians recommended sleeping upright on bolsters, believing gravity would discourage snoring. Others advised applying herbal compresses to the chest or sprinkling vinegar on linens. A particularly strange remedy involved tying a live eel skin around the throat, yes really, as a supposed anti-snore talisman. Historians still argue whether these were genuine attempts at science or just creative ways to justify billing the crown for extra eels. Sleepless queens had their own arsenal of tricks. Herbal teas brewed from chamomile, valerian, or poppy were prescribed, though too strong a dose risked more permanent slumber. Warm milk spiced with nutmeg was another standby, the medieval equivalent of NyQuil. Still, sleeplessness plagued many royal households. Insomnia wasn't just inconvenient, it could unravel tempers, influence decisions, even shift politics. A cranky monarch after a night of tossing and turning might cancel audiences or lash out at advisers. Court politics sometimes hinged on whether the sovereign had managed a decent nap. And then there were the whispered jokes. Servants, forbidden to laugh openly, still spread stories of kings whose snores drowned out thunderstorms, or of queens whose muttering prayers continued long after they were asleep. Humour was a way to humanize the untouchable, to remind everyone that beneath the crown lay the same mortal frailties. Imagine palace gossip starting with, "Did you hear him last night? Sounded like a warhorse choking on hay." But snoring and sleeplessness weren't just nuisances, they fed superstition. Restless sleep was seen as a sign of troubled conscience or divine disfavour. Chronic insomnia raised whispers of curses or witchcraft. Dreams mattered too, and if a king tossed violently, attendants might record it as a bad omen. Some even sat awake, scribbling notes on royal restlessness, as if charting weather patterns. The bedchamber doubled as both a doctor's office and a prophecy room. One quirky tidbit, Louis XIV's court at Versailles reportedly developed hand signals among servants for "His Majesty is asleep" versus "His Majesty snores again." This let attendants communicate silently across the room without waking him, like a royal version of charades played at 2 a.m. So, as you imagine yourself tucked into that feather mattress, the velvet curtains drawn, think of the soundscape, the slow crackle of candle wicks, the occasional drip of wax, and then suddenly the royal snore, rattling through brocade and echoing into history. Kings and queens, so powerful in daylight, became helpless in slumber, their quirks magnified, their humanity loud enough to keep half the palace awake. You might not expect it, but even dreams in a royal bedroom weren't private. What flickered across a monarch's sleeping mind could ripple out into politics, superstition, even war. In a world where rulers claimed divine authority, the line between an ordinary nightmare and a prophetic vision was dangerously thin. Close your eyes and you're not just dozing, you're producing state secrets for your attendants to whisper about by dawn. Dream interpretation was a serious business. If the king woke startled, muttering about shadows or floods, courtiers leaned in, eager to decode the omen. Floods might mean unrest. Fire could suggest rebellion. A dream of teeth falling out was almost always a bad sign. Someone important was about to die. Historians still argue whether monarchs truly believed these visions or simply used them as convenient excuses for decisions already made. But one thing's clear. The bedchamber doubled as an oracle's cave, every toss and turn carrying political weight. Some rulers even employed official dream interpreters. In ancient courts this was common, but traces survived into early modern Europe. Advisors studied classical manuals on dreams, cross-referenced with astrology, and presented careful analyses each morning. Picture being woken up at dawn to explain that the Queen's dream of chasing rabbits definitely signaled the need for a new tax on wool. It sounds absurd, but in a court hungry for meaning, absurdity was opportunity. Nightmares especially drew attention. Alexander the Great reportedly dreamed of a satyr before a key victory, and later monarchs clung to similar tales, half hoping their night terrors contained hidden blessings. By the Renaissance, bad dreams were sometimes blamed on indigestion, too much roasted boar before bed. Physicians suggested lighter suppers to avoid vapors clouding the mind. Others prescribed amulets under pillows or whispered prayers to saints. Some queens kept relics tucked into bedclothes, believing a sliver of holy bone would ward off evil dreams. Whether it worked, or just made for lumpy sleep, is debatable. And of course, there were moments of pure theatre. A king who awoke from a terrifying dream might immediately summon priests, demanding masses be sung to avert doom. The very act of responding turned the private into the public. By breakfast, everyone at court knew the monarch had seen something troubling. Gossip spread faster than candlelight, reshaping policies before lunch. Imagine your own nightmare about being chased by ducks, suddenly forcing Parliament to debate naval reform. One quirky tidbit? Medieval dream books circulated widely with handy glossaries: dream of flying, expect fortune; dream of snakes, beware betrayal; dream of fish, prepare for pregnancy. Nobles sometimes kept these books beside scripture, treating them almost as bedtime manuals. They're the medieval version of Googling dream about teeth falling out meaning at 3 a.m. Some dreams became legends in themselves. Richard III was said to have terrible visions the night before Bosworth Field, waking in dread. His bad sleep became part of the story of his downfall. Other monarchs claimed triumphant dreams before battles, weaving bedtime into propaganda. Sleep became a battlefield of its own, victory or defeat foreshadowed by images in the dark. But behind all this mysticism lay a simple truth. Monarchs were anxious. They bore the weight of crowns, thrones, wars, betrayals. Of course, their nights were haunted, and in a court where every detail was politicized, even a muttered word in sleep could be seized upon as evidence, prophecy, or scandal. So as you imagine yourself lying in that massive bed, curtains drawn, the scent of lavender sachets in the air, picture the silence broken not by snores this time, but by murmurs, half-dreamed words that attendants strain to catch. He said fire, one whispers. He said betrayal, insists another. By dawn, a monarch's fleeting nightmare becomes tomorrow's decree. For kings and queens, even dreams weren't their own. It's past midnight, the chamber dim, the candles burning low. You'd think the king or queen could finally enjoy some peace, but the truth is, royal bedrooms had revolving doors. Unexpected visitors might appear after dark, slipping past curtains and attendants, each arrival loaded with meaning. In a palace, the phrase "do not disturb" never really applied. There were, of course, the obvious visitors, spouses, mistresses, or favoured companions. A king's bed might be graced by a queen for ceremony and heirs, or by someone far less official for comfort. But beyond matters of the heart, the bedchamber was also a political waiting room. Ambassadors, advisors, even generals sometimes found themselves ushered in at odd hours. Imagine being called to discuss war strategy while your sovereign sat propped up on embroidered pillows, yawning in a nightshirt. It happened. Henry V was known to conduct counsel from bed, signing documents while still tangled in sheets. Awkward for the ambassador, but convenient for a monarch who didn't feel like standing. Who could enter was dictated by strict etiquette. In France, access to Louis XIV's chamber was tiered like an exclusive nightclub. High-ranking nobles could watch him wake or sleep. Lesser courtiers waited in outer rooms. The closer you got to the bed, the closer you were to power. Sometimes visitors pushed the limits. Rival courtiers jostled for the chance to slip in after hours, hoping to whisper requests when the king was half dreaming and more pliable. Historians still argue whether late-night petitions worked because monarchs were groggy or because attendants recorded them regardless. Then there were emergencies. Fires, uprisings, or sudden illnesses pulled courtiers straight into the chamber. Royal physicians often kept a sort of bedside pass to rush in whenever needed. One quirky tidbit: some courts kept an official stool inside the bedchamber for sudden visitors, so no one had to awkwardly stand at the monarch's bedside while they rubbed their eyes. Imagine a dignitary plopping down on the royal midnight chair, trying not to look too stiff while the king adjusted his blanket. And let's not ignore the more secretive visitors. Lovers sneaking through hidden passages were practically a palace tradition. Castles bristled with concealed doors, and bedchambers were often at the heart of those networks. Whispers tell of mistresses slipping in under cover of night, shielded by complicit servants. Sometimes they succeeded. Other times they were caught, scandal exploding by morning. Curtains, you recall, promised privacy but rarely delivered. Even spiritual visitors were expected. Priests or confessors might be called after dark if the king was troubled by dreams, nightmares, or conscience. Midnight confessions beside the bed were not unusual. In some cases they were publicized, proof of the monarch's piety. Imagine kneeling in a dim chamber, murmuring prayers while the sovereign pulled sheets closer around their shoulders. Religion was woven into sleep as tightly as silk linens. Not all visitors were welcome. Fears of assassins haunted many royal bedrooms. Guards stood watch, but rumors persisted of enemies disguised as attendants creeping in. Locks were reinforced, curtains checked for hiding figures, even chamber pots examined for poison. The idea of unexpected visitors could mean anything from a trusted minister with urgent news to a shadow with a dagger. For that reason, kings sometimes staged elaborate checks before sleep, inspectors sweeping the chamber, tasting food, even poking under the bed, the very things you do as a child when you're convinced a monster is hiding under there. Turns out monarchs never really outgrew that fear. One of the strangest accounts comes from James I of England, who reportedly feared assassination so deeply he refused to sleep alone. He surrounded himself with attendants, some practically in the bedchamber itself, and allowed late-night interruptions from trusted courtiers because solitude terrified him more than disturbance. The irony? His insistence on being guarded constantly made his chamber one of the busiest rooms after midnight. So, as you imagine yourself drifting off in those perfumed sheets, picture the rustle of footsteps in the corridor, the creak of hinges, the soft murmur of a visitor entering unannounced. Perhaps it's a priest, perhaps a lover, perhaps a minister, clutching news of rebellion. The royal bedroom was never truly closed. It was a chamber where power, secrecy, and intimacy collided, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in scandal, always in the shadows of midnight. Ever wondered what it would feel like to be ceremonially tucked into bed, by a roomful of people no less? In the royal world, going to sleep wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and yawning. It was a ritual, a performance, even a test of loyalty. You didn't just drift off, you were ceremonially couched. In France, the coucher of Louis XIV at Versailles turned bedtime into theatre. Nobles pressed into the chamber, straining for a glimpse as the king shed his day robes and slipped into a nightshirt. But this wasn't an intimate moment. It was choreographed. The privilege of handing him his shirt, of arranging his pillows, even of drawing the bed curtains, was fought over like Olympic medals. If you were chosen, you gained prestige. If you weren't, well, maybe you needed to bribe harder next time. Imagine the absurdity of dukes and princes grovelling for the chance to hold out a sleeve while the king stuck in his arm. The ceremony had layers. There was the grand coucher, attended by dozens of high-ranking courtiers, and the petit coucher, more private, reserved for only the most trusted. Nobles who secured access to the bedchamber weren't just closer to the king physically, they were closer politically. To be seen at the bedside was to be seen at the center of power. Historians still argue whether the Sun King actually enjoyed this circus or whether he simply endured it as another tool of control. Either way, the ritual solidified hierarchy every night. England had its own version. Tudor monarchs, for example, often had attendants known as grooms of the bedchamber. These men weren't just bodyguards, they were personal servants, entrusted with the intimate tasks of preparing the royal bed, helping the king undress, adjusting his sheets, even ensuring his slippers were placed within reach. All of it was part of their duty. A king's most private moments were observed, even assisted, by men whose careers depended on discretion. That sounds awkward, but in reality it was a badge of trust. Who else would you let help you out of your trousers in front of a crowd? The coucher wasn't just for show, though. It had symbolic meaning. By going to bed publicly, a king demonstrated he had nothing to hide. His body was open to the gaze of his people, well, at least his courtiers. Bedtime was proof that the monarch's life belonged to the state, down to his very dreams. A strange inversion, isn't it? You might grumble if your phone buzzes after 10 p.m., but for kings, the entire court was essentially standing by to watch them crawl under the covers. And of course, there were jokes, whispered, never spoken loudly. Servants joked about which nobles seemed most eager to tuck in the king, or how ridiculous it looked to have 3 grown men fighting over who got to fold down a corner of the blanket. One quirky tidbit: some nobles were so desperate for recognition that they would rehearse how to hand a candle to the king gracefully, practicing like it was a ballet. That's how far the scramble for favor went. For queens, the ritual sometimes included prayers, blessings, or even witnesses to ensure propriety. Especially on wedding nights, the presence of attendants confirmed that a marriage was properly launched. Sheets, as we've already seen, weren't just fabric, they were proof, evidence, stage curtains for dynastic performance. Even ordinary nights carried echoes of this. Ladies-in-waiting fussed over pillows, folded sheets just so, murmured prayers for safe sleep. Privacy was never the point, display was. And once the ceremony ended, attendants filed out, though not all of them. A few remained nearby in the outer chamber, ready to spring up if called. Imagine trying to drift into slumber knowing a valet is still sitting quietly just beyond the curtain, like a live-action nightlight. Royals learned to accept it. For them, the coucher wasn't intrusion, it was ritual comfort, a reminder that power hummed around them even as they closed their eyes. So as you stretch under your own blanket tonight, grateful no one's elbowing their way to hand you a pillow, remember, for monarchs, sleep itself was a ceremony. Every sigh, every fold of fabric, every candle snuffed was part of a choreography designed to remind everyone who held the crown and who was allowed close enough to watch it rest. Now imagine the bedroom not as a stage for ceremony, but as a prison of silk and stone. For queens, the most dramatic transformation of their chambers came during pregnancy, when tradition demanded confinement. The word sounds harsh, doesn't it? And in practice, it often was. The royal bedchamber became a gilded cage, a place where a woman both prepared to bring forth the future of a dynasty and surrendered much of her freedom. Royal pregnancies weren't private family affairs. They were state business. A queen's womb was essentially public property, her chamber a waiting room for an entire kingdom's hopes. Once her pregnancy was confirmed, she was often taken to chamber, a ritual seclusion that could last weeks or even months. Heavy curtains were drawn, windows shuttered, light dimmed. The queen was meant to stay inside, shielded from cold draughts, ill omens, and prying eyes. Some believed too much movement or noise could disturb the unborn child. Others whispered that isolation protected her from assassination attempts. Historians still argue whether this confinement was intended as genuine care or a convenient way to control women at their most vulnerable. The queen's bed itself became the focal point of this strange isolation. Draped in crimson or rich blue, chosen for their supposed protective powers, the bed stood like an altar of fertility. Relics or charms were sometimes hung from the canopy to ward off evil spirits. Candles blessed by priests might flicker at the bedside night after night. Imagine trying to nap while the scent of beeswax and incense lingers constantly in the air. Visitors were restricted but not absent. Midwives, physicians, and ladies-in-waiting attended, whispering advice and prayers. Conversations turned endlessly to omens. A fluttering curtain might predict a boy, a dream of water might hint at twins. The Queen's body became a canvas for endless interpretation, her every sigh or craving noted by anxious attendants. Quirky tidbit. In Tudor England, people believed that craving certain foods shaped the baby's features. If the Queen longed for strawberries, gossip spread that the child would be born with a rosy complexion. Imagine being immortalized because your mother had a sweet tooth. And when labor finally came, the bedchamber filled, not emptied. Privacy evaporated. Witnesses were summoned, sometimes dozens, because the birth of a royal heir was too important to be left behind closed doors. Nobles, clerics, even foreign envoys crowded in to ensure that the baby truly came from the Queen's body, and not, as paranoid rumors often suggested, swapped in with a peasant child. You probably wouldn't survive the stress of giving birth while half the government stood at the foot of your bed, but for queens, it was the price of legitimacy. The confinement chamber, for all its silks and perfumes, was claustrophobic. Imagine being forced to spend weeks without fresh air, sunlight blocked, surrounded by murmurs and prayers. Queens sometimes complained of depression, weariness, or irritability. But their complaints rarely mattered. What mattered was the baby, the future of dynasties, alliances, wars, and thrones. Their bedchamber became a crucible of expectation, where one woman's body carried the fate of nations. And yet, there were moments of resilience. Some queens turned their confinement into small courts of their own, ruling from bed, receiving letters, giving orders. Others demanded music, storytelling, or pets to ease the monotony. A few even found humor in their seclusion, joking about their cravings or their swollen ankles. Humanity, after all, refused to be fully smothered by ritual. So, as you picture yourself lying in that heavy, perfumed chamber, curtains drawn, air thick, attendants hovering, think about the strange blend of power and powerlessness. The Queen's bedroom, once a stage for ceremony, became a theatre of confinement, half sanctuary, half surveillance. Every candle flicker carried the weight of dynasties, every whispered prayer clung to the canopy. For the Queen, the chamber was not simply a place to sleep, but the site where history itself struggled into being. You lie in that royal bed, curtains drawn, warmth pooling in layers of fur and linen, and then you feel it, the creeping awareness that you are vulnerable. Eyes closed, crown set aside, weapons out of reach. Sleep was a dangerous act for monarchs. Kings and queens feared assassins slipping in at night, and their bedrooms reflected this paranoia. Poison was the most dreaded method. Food tasters sampled royal suppers, but suspicion didn't end at the dinner table. Sheets could be rubbed with toxins, pillows dusted with powders, or bed frames smeared with lethal concoctions. Some believed slow poisons could seep through the skin just by lying down. Servants scoured every inch of bedding before the monarch retired. A quirky tidbit. Some rulers insisted their linens be boiled in vinegar before use, hoping the sour bath neutralized hidden poisons. Whether it worked or just left everything smelling like a salad is still debated. Traps were another fear. Beds were heavy constructions, sometimes high off the ground. But what if an enemy crept beneath? Guards checked under the mattress, behind curtains, and inside chests. The paranoia was childlike in a way, you might laugh, remembering how you once checked under your own bed for monsters. The difference is, for kings, the monster was often real. Locks on bedchamber doors grew elaborate. Some monarchs slept with multiple bolts secured from inside. Others relied on attendants, who remained awake through the night. James IV of England notoriously feared stabbing in his sleep. He kept a knife at hand and never allowed himself to be alone. Ironically, his precautions, surrounding himself with watchful attendants, meant his chamber was one of the least private places in the palace. Sometimes, fear was justified. Henry IV of France was attacked multiple times, one attempt nearly killing him while he rested. Later, monarchs remembered such stories vividly. Beds became fortresses, canopies thickened, guards doubled. In Versailles, Louis XIV's chamber was like a mini garrison, with guards stationed so near that the king's dreams were practically public record. Historians still argue whether this was effective security or overblown theatre. And then there were charms, kings and queens, tucked relics beneath pillows or stitched protective symbols into sheets. A piece of the true cross, a saint's bone, a parchment inscribed with psalms, all were meant to keep assassins and demons alike at bay. To sleep was to surrender control. Superstition filled the gap. One queen even placed a small mirror under her pillow, believing it would reflect away evil spirits. Try explaining that in your Airbnb review. Of course, the paranoia wasn't just about murder, it was about whispers. Anyone with access to the bedchamber might overhear secrets, see signs of weakness, or notice illness. That information could be more deadly than a dagger. A faint cough, a restless night, a bad dream muttered aloud, those details fed court gossip, which in turn fed political maneuvering. Sleep wasn't only dangerous because of enemies, it was dangerous because it revealed too much. One curious anecdote, Edward II of England was said to have slept so lightly and so nervously that he startled awake at the faintest sound, sometimes lashing out at his attendants. The irony? His nervousness was justified, his reign was riddled with betrayal. A lifetime of paranoia condensed into restless nights. So as you pull the covers higher and imagine lying there as a monarch, remember that the royal bed was never just soft down and silken sheets. It was a stage, a throne, and sometimes a trap. To sleep was to risk everything. Every candle snuffed carried a whisper of danger. Every shadow on the curtain might be dagger or poison. You drift off, but never peacefully. In a royal bedroom, sleep itself was an act of courage. You might not expect it, but even the stars had a place in royal bedrooms. When kings and queens lay down at night, their fate wasn't thought to rest entirely in silken sheets or perfumed pillows. It was charted across the heavens. Astrologers hovered close to the throne by day, but their influence stretched right into the bedchamber, guiding when monarchs slept, when they rose, and sometimes when they dared to conceive. Imagine the scene, a court astrologer entering the bedchamber just as candles are being extinguished. He unfurls a parchment crowded with constellations, tilts his head toward the night sky, and announces that tonight's moon is ill-suited for rest. Perhaps a restless dream is likely, or worse, that enemies might gain the upper hand if the king sleeps too deeply. So attendants prepare a light vigil, keeping flames burning low to fend off evil influences. It sounds superstitious, but to rulers raised in a world of omens, these warnings carried weight. Astrology influenced everything, down to which side of the bed the monarch might roll onto. Was Venus ascendant? Then intimacy was encouraged. Was Saturn brooding overhead? Best to keep to one's own pillow. Historians still argue whether monarchs truly believed this or simply used the stars as a convenient backdrop for their decisions. But in practice, celestial charts dictated earthly routines even in the intimacy of night. Some rulers leaned heavily on these cosmic bedtime scripts. Elizabeth I of England was said to consult astrologer John Dee, whose calculations guided not only political maneuvers but also when she should rest or receive visitors. Was her insomnia a matter of overwork? Perhaps, but courtiers whispered it was the influence of Mercury, a planet thought to unsettle the mind. And then there were the grand predictions. A dream of fire might send an astrologer scrambling to cast charts, warning of uprisings or rebellion. A restless night was never just bad sleep, it was evidence of planetary misalignment. If Mars glared from the heavens, advisors whispered that the king should beware conflict. If Jupiter shone brightly, perhaps treaties would hold. Imagine being so scrutinized that even your tossing and turning became proof of cosmic forces at work. Quirky tidbit. Some monarchs had literal star maps painted on their bedchamber ceilings. It gave the illusion of sleeping under the heavens, and perhaps reassurance that destiny hovered protectively above. One Habsburg ruler even insisted that candles be arranged in constellation shapes each evening, a miniature galaxy flickering overhead. Beautiful, yes, but smoky, costly, and probably a fire hazard. Of course, Skepticism lingered even then. Some courtiers rolled their eyes when astrologers prescribed auspicious hours for rest. Others embraced it, especially if it aligned with their own agendas. If an advisor wanted to delay a royal decision, what better excuse than "The stars advise caution, Your Majesty," perhaps after a good night's sleep? Historians still argue whether astrologers were genuine believers or shrewd opportunists who used celestial language to control earthly kings. Still, for many monarchs, stargazing brought comfort. To look upward before bed, to believe the night sky whispered guidance, was to imagine a universe that cared about your crown. When so much of the day was filled with betrayal, poison, and restless ceremony, the stars offered order, a cosmic canopy to rival the velvet one above the bed. So as you stretch in those perfumed sheets, imagine glancing upward, not at a smoke-stained ceiling, but at constellations traced in gold paint, flickering candlelight mimicking stars. You drift into sleep knowing your attendants will record your dreams, your astrologer will chart their meaning, and the court will whisper tomorrow that Mars, Jupiter, or Venus guided your rest. In a royal bedroom, even the silence of the night was written in the language of the stars. You roll onto your side, and instead of ministers or astrologers, you find a softer presence at the foot of the royal bed. A pair of bright eyes in the gloom, tail curled, breath steady. Royals didn't always sleep alone. Sometimes their most loyal companions were four-legged. Pets were more than indulgences. They were warmth, comfort, and sometimes living symbols of status that shared the sheets with kings and queens. Dogs were the most common bedfellows. Small lapdogs in particular were favoured by queens and princesses. Mary, Queen of Scots, famously had a tiny terrier that hid beneath her skirts even during her execution, an enduring image of loyalty. At night, these lapdogs nestled under blankets, serving as both comforters and tiny hot water bottles. Imagine being wrapped in furs and silks, but still relying on a shivering puff of a dog to keep your toes warm. Practical, if slightly undignified. Cats, less common in royal beds, still had their moments. Some queens tolerated them as hunters of mice, though others believed feline as carried witchcraft. One quirky tidbit: Cardinal Richelieu, though not a monarch himself, famously kept a veritable colony of cats that followed him everywhere, including into bedchambers. Royal imitators sometimes did the same, despite whispers that cats brought restless dreams. Historians still argue whether these feline companions were genuine pets, or just tolerated pest control with an air of luxury. Exotic animals made appearances too. Monkeys, parrots, even tamed lions or leopards occasionally found themselves near royal chambers, though keeping such beasts close to the bed was more about show than comfort. A parrot might shriek nonsense in the dark, disrupting slumber, but it proved the monarch's reach stretched to far-off lands. Not the most restful lullaby, but certainly impressive. For some monarchs, animals symbolized deeper bonds. Elizabeth Thurston adored her greyhounds, and portraits show her with loyal canine companions by her side. Charles II of England doted on his spaniels so much that the breed, Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, still bears his name. Court gossips joked that he lavished more attention on them than on his ministers. Imagine slipping into bed only to find half your dogs already sprawled across the sheets, and you'll get the picture. Pets weren't just cuddly, they were security. Dogs alerted to footsteps in corridors, barked at strangers, and sometimes gave warning of danger faster than human guards. For a monarch fearful of assassins, a growling hound might mean the difference between safety and vulnerability. Sleep felt less risky with a pair of sharp ears resting by the hearth, yet animals could stir scandal. Complaints circulated about fleas or odours in royal bedding, blamed on pampered lapdogs. Satirists mocked queens who cooed over puppies while ignoring their subjects. In Versailles, courtiers grumbled that the king's favourite dogs had freer access to his chamber than most nobles did. The bedroom wasn't just a stage of politics, it was a kennel of favouritism, sometimes literally. And pets, of course, crept into rituals of death. Mary, Queen of Scots' terrier, refusing to leave her body, became a symbol of loyalty in ballads. Other royal pets were buried in ornate tombs, sometimes with epitaphs more affectionate than those given to courtiers. Monarchs, so often betrayed by humans, found in animals a kind of unconditional devotion, even if it meant scratched sheets and muddy paw prints on priceless linens. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the weight at the foot of the bed, not as duty or danger, but as a furry companion. You feel a dog curl tighter against your legs, hear its soft sigh, maybe even endure its snore. In the world of royal bedrooms, pets blurred the line between opulence and ordinariness. They reminded kings and queens that even beneath crowns and ceremony, a warm body pressed against your feet at night could be the simplest, most human comfort of all. Now picture the chamber after the pets have curled up and the candles are dimmed. The king or queen stretches beneath the covers, but what exactly are they wearing? You might assume flowing silk pajamas or regal nightgowns stitched with jewels. The truth is, stranger and sometimes far less glamorous. Royal nightwear was a mix of practicality, tradition, and fashion quirks that make your modern pajamas look like haute couture. For centuries, the basic choice was the simple linen shift or nightshirt. Picture an oversized, long-sleeved tunic falling to the knees, plain and serviceable. Kings and queens alike wore these, loose, airy, easy to launder. But of course, royalty couldn't leave well enough alone. Some were embroidered with golden thread, some edged with lace, some perfumed with herbs. Even in sleep, fabric whispered status. Kings often wore what amounted to a glorified undershirt. In the Tudor court, Henry VIII's nightshirts were sometimes stitched with blackwork embroidery, intricate patterns that might be hidden under blankets but still spoke of wealth. Was it comfortable? Probably not. But imagine insisting your sleepwear be so fancy that servants had to hand-wash delicate stitching every morning. Historians still argue whether these ornate touches were genuine preferences or simply courtly expectations, that even at rest the monarch embodied magnificence. Queens, meanwhile, had a trickier relationship with nightwear. Some wore shifts similar to their husbands. Others donned bedgowns, loose, flowing garments of silk or velvet, cut to impress. In France, a queen's robe de nuit could be so elaborate it blurred the line between sleepwear and a casual day gown. Practical? Not exactly. But if your bed doubled as a stage for ambassadors and attendants, your pajamas had to hold up under scrutiny. Quirky tidbit? In the 17th century, some royals experimented with Indian cottons and Turkish gowns, garments inspired by global trade. Exotic fabrics filtered into bedrooms, giving monarchs a cosmopolitan flair even in their dreams. Picture a king lounging in imported cotton, pretending at exotic sophistication while still snoring like a bear. And sometimes less was more. Rumours swirled that certain kings preferred to sleep nearly naked, with only a shirt to cover them. Charles VI of England reportedly despised heavy garments in bed, tossing aside finery in favour of bare simplicity. This shocked courtiers who expected every royal action, even slumber, to be gilded. Meanwhile, Catherine the Great was said to favour lightweight shifts, while layering her bed instead of her body. More covers, fewer clothes. Honestly, a strategy you've probably used on a cold night too. But nightwear wasn't just about comfort or vanity, it carried symbolism. When monarchs fell ill, their bedclothes became political objects. Courtiers noted whether the king had appeared in a plain nightshirt or a regal bedgown, interpreting it as a sign of strength or weakness. Sometimes garments were preserved as relics, stained with sweat or blood, reminders of mortality wrapped in fabric. There's also the social side. Servants were present when monarchs changed into nightwear, and these moments could be as competitive as any public ceremony. In Versailles, courtiers vied for the honour of holding the king's nightshirt. Yes, really. You think it's silly when people fight over front row seats at a concert? Imagine brawling over the chance to hand Louis XIV a piece of linen. So, as you pull on your own sleepwear tonight, whether it's flannel pajamas, a worn t-shirt, or nothing at all, remember the royal chamber was its own runway. Monarchs slid beneath embroidered sheets, not as ordinary sleepers, but as icons whose very nightclothes carried messages of wealth, taste, and power. And while you'll never have to worry about nobles fighting to hand you your pajamas, you might still chuckle, knowing that some of the world's most powerful rulers were judged not just by crowns and battles, but by what they wore to bed. The curtains are drawn, the monarch is in nightclothes, the attendants are dismissed to the outer chamber, and then the whispers begin. Because if there's one thing royal bedrooms produced as reliably as heirs, it was gossip. Beds, after all, were never just for sleeping. They were rumour factories where whispers slipped past velvet drapes and echoed down stone corridors. Imagine being a valet station just outside, listening through layers of fabric. You hear muffled voices, laughter perhaps, or sharp words carried by candlelight. By morning, those fragments grow into tales, half-truths, exaggerations, scandalous rumours repeated from kitchen to council. If the king shared a private joke with a lady-in-waiting, the palace soon whispered it was an affair. If the queen sighed in her sleep, someone swore she was weeping. The royal bedchamber was the quietest place in the palace, but it generated the loudest stories, and gossip wasn't harmless. In dynasties where legitimacy meant everything, what happened under the sheets could topple governments. Was the marriage cold? Was the queen barren? Did the king favour a mistress? Even small details became political. A monarch rising later than usual, or looking fatigued, could spark rumours of illness, poisoning, or sexual weakness. Historians still argue whether some kings lost authority more through battlefield defeats or through bedroom whispers. Sometimes the gossip was orchestrated. Ambitious courtiers planted rumours, hinting they'd been close to the royal bed, or had witnessed things they likely hadn't. A single nod or smile from a monarch might be inflated into tales of favouritism. One quirky tidbit? At Versailles, the king's coucher became such a public event that courtiers boasted of who had been allowed closest to the bed, as though proximity alone hinted at secret influence. Imagine bragging to your friends that you got to hold the royal pillow and therefore controlled foreign policy. Mistresses, of course, fueled the fire. When Charles II filled Whitehall with his lovers, the gossip mill practically caught fire. Details of who slipped behind curtains, how long they stayed, and what gifts they received were currency at court. For queens, gossip was crueler. A queen who failed to conceive became the subject of endless whispered speculation. Was it her fault? Was the king impotent? Did she have a secret lover? Palaces thrived on such cruel talk, spreading blame like wildfire, and servants, always watching, played their part. Laundry maids noticed stains on sheets, chamberlains observed late-night visitors, guards recognized footsteps. A spotted kerchief or misplaced slipper could spark weeks of scandal. These lowly attendants wielded dangerous power. A laundress's whisper could ruin reputations. A groom of the stool, responsible for the king's most private bodily functions, might know more about royal health than the physicians. Secrets in the bedchamber were rarely safe for long. Sometimes gossip became political weapons. In France, pamphleteers published scandalous accounts of Marie Antoinette's supposed bedroom antics, none of them true, but all of them devastating. The royal bed became a symbol of decadence, proof, in the public imagination, that the monarchy had rotted from within. The irony? The queen was often lonely, her real nights marked by silence and isolation rather than excess. Yet gossip carried more power than reality. Even dreams leaked into gossip. If a king muttered in sleep, attendants sometimes claimed to hear prophetic phrases. He said the word fire, one insisted. By dawn, whispers spread that war was imminent. Truth or not, the rumour itself mattered. In palaces where every syllable was political, even a sleep talker could accidentally launch a scandal. So as you tuck yourself in tonight, think of the strange duality of royal beds. They were supposed to be sanctuaries, private retreats, yet they buzzed with more chatter than any council chamber. Sheets carried stories, curtains hid scandals, whispers turned into weapons. For a monarch, the question wasn't whether gossip escaped the bedchamber. It was how quickly it spread and who would twist it by morning. You wouldn't think midnight was the time for feasting, but royal bedrooms often doubled as late-night kitchens. Picture it, the palace is quiet, servants have banked the fires, and then suddenly footsteps, a knock, and trays of food carried into the bedchamber. Because kings and queens, like you, sneaking to the fridge at 2 a.m., were not above indulging after hours, the difference, their snacks came on silver platters. Midnight feasts were more common than you'd expect. Heavy dinners in the early evening often left monarchs restless or still hungry, so they summoned liveries, small meals served at night. These might include roasted meats, candied fruits, or spiced wine poured steaming into cups. Some kings favoured sweetmeats, others savoury pies. Henry VIII was infamous for midnight banquets, his appetite so legendary that courtiers joked his bedchamber smelled more like a tavern than a throne room. Wine, too, flowed freely. A warm cup of wine mixed with spices, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, was thought to encourage sleep. Physicians recommended it as a draught to calm nerves and settle the stomach. In truth, it probably left monarchs snoring louder than ever. Still, the belief in medicinal nightcaps persisted. Historians still argue whether these concoctions were genuinely meant as cures or just excuses for royal indulgence. Queens had their preferences as well. Catherine de' Medici was said to favour candied violets at night, while Elizabeth I enjoyed sugared almonds. These weren't just luxuries, they were political symbols. Exotic spices and sugar were imported at great expense. To eat them casually at midnight was to display power, to show the world you literally consumed empires in your bed. But indulgence came at a cost. Heavy feasting late at night often led to indigestion, restlessness, or vivid dreams. Physicians fretted that overstuffed stomachs clogged the body's humours, causing nightmares or worse. One quirky tidbit: doctors sometimes advised monarchs to nibble lettuce before bed to aid digestion, centuries before bedtime salads became a joke. Of course, no king wanted to be remembered for lettuce when boar's head was available. There was also the ritual of who delivered the feast. Trusted servants carried in the trays, and each bite was scrutinized for safety. Poison remained a constant fear. Wine tasters sampled cups before they touched royal lips, and attendants hovered, watching for signs of distress. A midnight snack wasn't just indulgence, it was theatre of trust, and sometimes these feasts weren't solitary. Close companions, mistresses, or even favoured courtiers were invited to share. A quiet chamber transformed into an intimate supper club where secrets were spilled over goblets of spiced wine. More than one alliance, affair, or betrayal began at these candle-lit spreads. Imagine your boss calling you into their bedroom at midnight, not for work, but for pie and gossip. That was politics by pastry. Of course, not all nightcaps were so indulgent. Some monarchs relied on herbal draughts brewed to bring sleep, chamomile, valerian, or poppy seed infusions. These sleeping potions teetered between medicine and danger. A stronger dose meant deeper rest, but risked not waking at all. Physicians walked a fine line between calming their sovereign and accidentally ending their reign. Quirky detail: some kings swore by warmed beer with herbs. Yes, beer as a sleeping aid, about as appetizing as warm soda, but apparently effective. So as you picture the royal bedchamber at midnight, don't imagine silence. Imagine silver trays clinking, goblets pouring, the soft crunch of candied fruit, and the faint smell of spices curling into the heavy air. In those hours, kings and queens were most human, restless, indulgent, craving comfort. The royal bed wasn't just for sleep, it was for feasts, secrets, and draughts that blurred the line between medicine and indulgence. You might think kings and queens slept deeply after all that midnight wine and feasting, but some of them dreaded the night more than battle. Insomnia haunted royal bedrooms, turning long hours into endless pacing, candle stubs into anxious companions. Power didn't guarantee peace of mind. In fact, the crown often stole sleep. Take Philip II of Spain, a monarch weighed down by empire. Chroniclers noted his restless nights, pacing corridors of the Escorial, muttering prayers instead of resting. His sleeplessness became legendary, a symbol of his constant vigilance. or, depending on who you asked, of his gnawing guilt. Insomnia in a king wasn't just a private annoyance, it became a political narrative, proof of diligence, or evidence of weakness. Historians still argue whether rulers exaggerated their sleeplessness to appear more devoted to their duties, or whether their duties simply drove them mad. Other monarchs left similar stories. Charles II of France suffered such terrible nights that he often emerged in the morning haggard, convinced the shadows of his dreams had followed him into daylight. Elizabeth, I confessed to close companions that she lay awake for hours, mind racing with threats and intrigues. One quirky tidbit? She reportedly had musicians play softly outside her chamber to lull her to sleep, a kind of Tudor white noise machine centuries before fans or apps. Doctors prescribed remedies, of course, warm milk spiced with nutmeg, draughts of poppy juice, or herbal pillows stuffed with valerian. None were foolproof. Some monarchs took to reading scripture or poetry by candlelight until their eyes drooped. Others summoned companions to talk until exhaustion set in. Louis XIV, despite his pomp, sometimes demanded small talk at his bedside, a stream of chatter to drown out his restless mind. Imagine being summoned at 2 a.m. just to gossip until the king finally nodded off. But insomnia wasn't merely medical, it was deeply symbolic. The sleepless king became a metaphor for vigilance, a ruler too devoted to slumber. Courtiers whispered admiration for monarchs who never rested, even as those same monarchs stumbled through council meetings bleary-eyed. Was the insomnia genuine or performance? Historians still debate it, but the effect was the same. Nights filled with pacing, prayers, and flickering shadows, and sometimes insomnia grew into terror. James V of England, convinced assassins lurked everywhere, often refused to sleep alone. Guards, attendants, even dogs were stationed within reach, their presence meant to comfort, but only adding to the sense of unease. Try sleeping while 6 men in armor and 2 spaniels stare at you. It's not exactly restful. Of course, insomnia also produced some bizarre habits. Frederick the Great of Prussia reportedly scribbled military orders by candlelight when he couldn't sleep, sending messengers through the night. Napoleon, centuries later, was famous for short, irregular bursts of sleep, rising at odd hours to write correspondence. The royal bedchamber in these cases became less a place of rest than an office with curtains. And then there were the superstitions. Some monarchs believed sleeplessness was punishment from God, others thought it was witchcraft. Amulets were placed under pillows, relics hung from bedposts, prayers whispered into the sheets. One quirky anecdote tells of a queen who blamed her insomnia on evil air drifting through cracks in the chamber, so attendants stuffed herbs into every crevice until the room smelled like a salad bowl. Did it help? Doubtful. But the symbolism reassured her, and sometimes that was enough. So as you settle into your own bed tonight, be glad your mind isn't burdened with empires, betrayals, and dynastic anxieties. Imagine instead the monarch, crown set aside, staring at the canopy above, haunted by thoughts too heavy to sleep. The palace grows quiet, but inside the bedchamber, footsteps echo as a restless king or queen paces through the night. For them, insomnia wasn't just a curse of the body, it was the shadow of power itself, stretching long across the sheets. The palace is hushed, the king finally drowsing, but in the nursery chambers nearby, another kind of royal night is unfolding. Princes and princesses, future heirs to dynasties, weren't left to ordinary cribs. Their slumber was carefully staged, just like their parents'. And while you might picture sweet lullabies and gentle rocking, the reality was more complex, and sometimes just as political. Royal infants didn't sleep in quiet solitude. They were surrounded by nurses, wet nurses, rockers, and attendants who hovered night and day. A gilded cradle might stand at the foot of the queen's bed, its canopy draped with embroidered silk. The cradle itself could be a masterpiece, carved wood, gold leaf, velvet linings. These weren't just beds, they were thrones in miniature, symbols that the child within was destined for power. One quirky tidbit: the cradle of Louis XIV was so ornate that chroniclers described it almost like a piece of crown regalia. an object of awe as much as utility. But these little beds weren't only for show. Practical concerns mattered too. Babies were swaddled tightly, wrapped in bands of linen meant to keep them straight-limbed and properly formed. To modern eyes it looks restrictive, but in that time, swaddling was seen as necessary discipline, even in sleep. A royal baby looked less like a cuddly infant and more like a tiny, cocooned log. Imagine trying to wiggle free under a canopy of gold while 3 attendants hover with anxious expressions. Night-time in the nursery was noisy. Nurses crooned lullabies, maids tended fires, and guards patrolled nearby. Sleep for a royal infant was never solitary. Every breath was observed, every cry noted. If the child coughed or stirred, someone was there to record it. The future of kingdoms lay in that cradle, and a missed symptom could alter dynasties. Historians still argue whether this obsessive surveillance protected royal children or exposed them to constant meddling and illness. There were rituals too. Some nurseries burned incense or herbs to purify the air. Candles blessed by priests flickered near the crib, guarding against spirits. Amulets or charms might be tied to the cradle for luck, coral beads to ward off evil, small relics for divine blessing. To sleep in a royal cradle was to be tucked beneath layers of superstition as thick as any blanket. But even with all the attention, tragedy was common. Infant mortality stalked every dynasty. Nights in royal nurseries were often haunted by loss, the silence of a cradle too still. That's why every cry was treasured, every restless turn treated as both nuisance and blessing. Kings and queens might rule empires, but in the bedchamber of a child, they were as powerless as any parents, hoping for survival with every dawn. And yet joy lingered. Imagine a queen leaning over the cradle, touching the tiny fist of a future king, or a nurse whispering a lullaby while rocking a child whose birth secured alliances, treaties, wars. Sleep became not just a biological need, but a political symbol. The child resting meant the dynasty endured. Quirky detail: some princes were lulled to sleep with music performed just for them, harps, viols, or soft singing. One Habsburg heir reportedly had a designated musician whose only task was to play him to sleep every night. Not exactly Baby Shark, but the 16th century equivalent of a bedtime playlist. So as you imagine yourself drifting into your own bed, picture the smaller gilded beds of princes and princesses, swaddled tightly, guarded by watchful attendants, perfumed by herbs and guarded by relics. The nursery was not simply a place of innocence. It was a theatre of hope and fear, where each night's rest carried the weight of dynasties yet to come. The nursery may have been filled with tiny snores and lullabies, but in the royal bedchamber next door, other footsteps slipped past the curtains, because not every visitor after dark was there to sing hymns or discuss politics. Some came for something far more dangerous: passion. Royal mistresses often found their way behind the velvet drapes, turning the king's bed into a battleground of secrecy and scandal. You probably imagine clandestine affairs unfolding in hidden corners, but the reality was both more public and more absurd. Everyone knew. The courtiers, the guards, the laundresses, they could all trace the signs. A queen's bed might remain ceremonially occupied, while a mistress's slippers were noticed beneath the canopy of the king's private chamber. One chamberlain even joked that he could track the monarch's love life simply by counting how many pairs of shoes lay scattered by the royal bedside. These affairs weren't just personal indulgences, they were politics. A mistress in the king's bed often wielded influence greater than ministers. Louis XV's Madame de Pompadour, for example, didn't just share his sheets, she shaped his cultural policies and diplomatic alliances. The royal bedroom, therefore, was not just a place of whispers, it was a cabinet of power. Historians still argue whether kings used mistresses to balance factions at court, or whether the women themselves leveraged intimacy to rise above enemies. Likely both. And secrecy? That was mostly a farce. Hidden passageways made for dramatic tales, but more often mistresses entered under the open eyes of servants, who simply pretended not to notice. In Versailles, the king's maîtresse en titre was so official that she had her own apartments directly linked to the royal bedchamber. Imagine institutionalizing an affair so thoroughly that architects designed it into the floor plan. Queens, of course, bore the brunt of humiliation. They were expected to endure, to smile, to produce heirs while husbands entertained lovers. Gossip spread cruelly. Every mistress's presence a dagger to a queen's reputation. Some queens ignored it, some raged privately, and some, like Catherine de' Medici, quietly built networks of spies to counter the influence of their rivals. Their bedchambers became sites of quiet resistance, even as the king's chamber buzzed with laughter and intrigue. There's a quirky tidbit about Henry IV of France. He was such a notorious womanizer that his bedchamber was nicknamed the Marketplace. Courtiers joked that the line outside his curtains was longer than the line at his throne. Hardly flattering, but it reveals how public the supposedly private realm of the bed could become. And yet, behind the jokes and scandals, danger lurked. Mistresses drew enemies as quickly as they drew affection. Poisonings were rumoured, daggers threatened, reputations shredded by pamphlets. A woman who entered the king's bed might rise to dizzying heights or fall spectacularly. The royal bed, warm with passion, was also a furnace of peril. For kings, mistresses were escape, an antidote to arranged marriages, a rebellion against duty. For mistresses, the bed was both opportunity and trap. Some found genuine affection, others played careful games of survival. For queens, the bed was both crown and chain. And for the kingdom, what happened in those chambers sometimes shaped alliances, wars, and succession itself. So, as you imagine the flicker of candlelight behind drawn curtains, picture not just silken sheets, but whispered bargains, laughter laced with politics, and footsteps that echoed louder than they should have. The royal bedchamber was never truly secret. Its affairs, literal and figurative, spilled out into history, leaving behind a trail of scandal, power, and stories that still smoulder centuries later. You settle deeper into the imagined bed, and the velvet curtains seem to press in with a heavier weight. Because in the royal bedroom, intimacy was never entirely private. It was often a matter of state. Marriage in dynasties wasn't about love, it was about politics, alliances, and heirs. And that meant the consummation of a marriage, the act of proving it had truly begun, was everyone's business. Strange as it sounds, the royal bedchamber could become a courtroom. On the wedding night, after ceremonies, blessings, and feasts, the bride and groom were escorted to bed. Nobles, bishops, and attendants sometimes crowded the room, watching as the couple was ceremonially undressed and laid beneath the covers. No, they didn't stand there waiting for a full performance, but they stayed long enough to see the union was real, at least symbolically. Only when curtains were drawn did the couple get privacy, though even then, privacy meant servants waiting within earshot. Historians still argue whether these rituals were truly necessary or whether they were designed mostly to humiliate, binding the couple's duty to public scrutiny. In France, the royal bedding ceremony was formalized. The king and queen's first night was blessed by priests, attended by courtiers, and often followed by the careful inspection of linens the next morning. Yes, linens. Stained sheets were presented as proof of consummation. Imagine your wedding night becoming a forensic investigation by candlelight. It wasn't romantic, it was dynastic bookkeeping. The stakes were enormous. Without consummation, a marriage could be annulled, alliances broken, treaties undone. Monarchs could be accused of impotence, queens of frigidity. Henry VIII's disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves unravelled, partly because he claimed he couldn't consummate it, blaming her, of course, for not pleasing him. The excuse became political dynamite. A bed that didn't yield an heir could topple entire policies. And then there were the rumours. If a bride entered marriage with a questionable reputation, courtiers whispered, whether her virginity was intact. Midwives or trusted attendants might be asked to verify, an invasive, humiliating practice. The royal bedchamber became a stage not of tenderness but of suspicion and proof. One quirky tidbit: in Spain, marriage ceremonies sometimes included the public blessing of the bridal bed, with clergy sprinkling holy water directly on the sheets. Imagine kneeling while a priest blesses your blanket. solemnly declaring it a tool of dynastic continuity. Comforting? Maybe. Romantic? Hardly. Yet, despite the rigid formalities, couples carved out moments of humanity. Letters survived from monarchs who, after enduring the ceremonial charade, later confessed affection for their spouses behind closed curtains. Others, though, chafed under the scrutiny, turning to mistresses or secret affairs for genuine intimacy. And for queens, the pressure was suffocating. A woman's worth was judged by whether she bore children, and quickly. Every night in bed carried political weight. Was she fertile? Was she healthy? Was she faithful? Her body became a battlefield of speculation. For a queen, the bedroom was less a sanctuary than an examination hall. But let's not forget the farce. Court jesters, satirists, and pamphleteers mocked these rituals, joking that kings needed less ceremony and more performance. Pamphlets circulated accusing monarchs of weakness in bed, a political insult as cutting as losing a war. Even the sheets became punchlines. So, as you imagine slipping into a bed under watchful eyes, remember that for royals, marriage was never just about companionship. The royal bed was a contract, a courtroom, and a stage all at once. Love might sometimes bloom there, but duty always came first. And while you get to fall asleep tonight without proving anything to a crowd, kings and queens had to endure the cruel absurdity of turning their most private act into public business. You'd think the royal bedchamber was a place of escape, but it was also a workplace, especially for doctors. Monarchs were considered too important to risk even a sneeze without medical oversight, so royal physicians lingered close, often just a chamber away. Sometimes they were summoned at midnight for something as small as a cough. Other times they hovered through the night, watching over their sovereign like anxious babysitters with advanced degrees in leeches. Imagine being the king trying to rest, and there's your physician perched nearby, quill and notebook in hand, waiting to record every sigh. Physicians didn't just prescribe medicines, they monitored. Did the monarch toss and turn? Did he sweat too much? Did she complain of pain? These became political data points, whispered through the palace by dawn. A monarch's sleep was never just private, it was a matter of state health bulletins. Treatments often seeped into the bed itself. Herbal sachets were stitched into pillows, lavender to calm, rosemary to purify, hops to induce sleep. Some doctors advised rubbing ointments onto sheets, mixtures of vinegar, herbs and oils, meant to fend off plague or settle humours. Quirky tidbit? In one French court, a physician recommended stuffing the king's mattress with chamomile blossoms to soothe his nerves. Lovely in theory, but imagine sneezing all night because you're lying on a meadow. And then there were potions, poppy syrups, laudanum or wine laced with herbs were offered as nightcaps. The problem? Doses were unpredictable, too little, and the monarch remained awake, pacing. Too much. And attendants panicked, fearing he'd never wake again. Historians still argue whether physicians genuinely believed in these remedies or simply hoped that by doing something they'd preserve favour. Either way, the royal bed became a testing ground for medieval pharmacology, half medicine, half gamble. Sometimes the rituals bordered on absurd. In the 16th century, English physicians advised wrapping a monarch's head in red cloth to ward off headaches during sleep. Others suggested pressing warm bread against the chest or placing a freshly slaughtered pigeon on the stomach to draw out fevers. Yes, a pigeon. Imagine being woken at 3 a.m. with a doctor gently laying poultry on your torso. If that doesn't cure you, at least it distracts you. But doctors weren't only healers, they were spies. Their proximity to the royal body gave them knowledge no one else had. A physician who knew the king's ailments could wield enormous influence. Was the monarch strong enough to ride into battle? Weak enough to be manipulated? Physicians walked a fine line between trusted guardian and potential political weapon. Some even betrayed secrets to rival factions, leaking details of sleepless nights or troubling symptoms. Queens, too, were monitored closely. Physicians were summoned during confinements, hovered during pregnancies, and sat vigil through the night if labour was difficult. Their presence reinforced that even the Queen's sleep, or lack of it, was part of the machinery of state. A restless night might be interpreted as stress over succession. A peaceful one might be celebrated as divine blessing. And when illness struck, the bedchamber transformed entirely. Curtains were pulled back, light flooded in, physicians consulted, and the monarch's night became a blur of examinations and concoctions. Attendants held bowls, applied poultices, counted pulses. Sleep, once elusive, became a prescribed medicine itself. "Rest, your majesty," they urged, as though rest could be commanded like an army. So as you imagine your own doctor far away at a neat office desk, be glad he isn't stationed at the foot of your bed, scribbling notes on how many times you roll over. In the royal chamber, the physician was always on call, always watchful, always ready to intrude. For kings and queens, sleep was never just sleep. It was a medical performance, overseen by anxious eyes, and dictated by the latest theories in humours, herbs, and sometimes pigeons. You shift under the covers, imagining the royal bed itself, immense, carved, embroidered. But here's the surprising part. Those beds didn't always stay put. In fact, royal beds often travelled with their owners, packed up like luggage and hauled across kingdoms. A monarch on campaign or even on a tour of estates expected the same bedchamber comforts as at court. The bed was not just furniture, it was a mobile throne of sleep and authority. Take the Tudors, for instance. Henry VIII had great state beds, dismantled, transported, and reassembled wherever he went. Servants carted the heavy frames, ropes, mattresses, and linens from one castle to another, like an entire IKEA set without instructions. Imagine trudging through mud with a cart full of swan's-down mattresses, only to set them up again by candlelight. The royal caravan wasn't just soldiers and cooks, it included carpenters and valets whose job was literally to re-rope the king's bed before nightfall. Beds mattered so much that entire travelling chambers were built around them. Tents on campaigns weren't simple canvas shelters. Monarchs like Francis I of France slept under elaborate pavilions, with their state beds set up inside, complete with curtains, tapestries, and carpets. On the battlefield, the royal bedchamber looked more like a miniature palace than a soldier's tent. Quirky tidbit? At the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, Henry VIII's travelling bed was so magnificent it rivaled the luxury of his host's permanent palaces, brocade, gold embroidery, and all. The bed itself became a diplomatic statement. Even the linens travelled. Special chests carried sheets, pillows, and embroidered covers guarded like treasure. Each piece was catalogued and washed carefully en route. Losing a royal pillow wasn't just careless housekeeping, it could be treated as theft of crown property. Imagine being a servant hauled before the king because you misplaced his favourite bolster somewhere between Dover and Calais. There's also a practical side. Monarchs feared assassination, and sleeping in strange places increased paranoia. By bringing their own beds, they controlled at least one piece of the environment. Familiar sheets, trusted servants, checked linens, these comforts made foreign chambers slightly less threatening. Historians still argue whether this was more about security or superstition, but it gave monarchs a sense of continuity in the chaos of travel. And then there's the spectacle. A royal bed set up in a provincial town hall wasn't just for rest, it was theatre. Locals might be admitted to glimpse it, awestruck by the silks and embroidery. The bed embodied majesty even when unoccupied, a symbol that the king or queen had blessed the place with presence. People bowed to the bed itself as though it carried the aura of royalty. Not every monarch insisted on comfort, though. Some adopted Spartan habits to project toughness. Elizabeth I sometimes slept on relatively simple travelling pallets, emphasizing discipline. Others, like Louis XIV, demanded full luxury even in the field. Soldiers grumbled as they marched through mud, while the Sun King reclined on feathers beneath velvet. One quirky anecdote, when Mary, Queen of Scots, fled after her defeat at Carberry Hill, her grand bed of state was reportedly abandoned, too bulky to transport in haste. The image of a magnificent bed left behind in a field became a metaphor for her fall, power stripped away, fabric torn from its stage. So as you picture yourself rolling over tonight, be grateful your bed stays where it is. For kings and queens, sleep was portable, but it came at the price of endless labor, spectacle, and symbolism. Their beds weren't just where they closed their eyes, they were extensions of their crowns, packed and unpacked, carried across kingdoms like heavy, embroidered shadows of their rule. The royal bedchamber, already thick with curtains, perfumes, and attendants, carried another invisible presence: superstition. For kings and queens, night wasn't only about resting, it was about guarding against unseen dangers that prowled in darkness. Midnight was a liminal hour, when spirits were believed to slip closer, when witches cast spells, and when restless souls brushed past bedposts. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a fortress against the supernatural. Before retiring, monarchs often performed rituals. Candles blessed by priests were lit to chase away shadows. Relics, tiny shards of bone, fragments of the true cross or saintly medals, were tucked into pillows or stitched into sheets. Some kings wore amulets around their necks as they slept, believing the metal or gemstone would repel evil. Quirky tidbit: James the Fauch of England, terrified of witchcraft, sometimes slept with protective charms under his mattress, convinced witches might infiltrate his dreams. Historians still argue whether he was truly paranoid or simply reflecting the era's widespread fear. Spirits weren't the only concern. Nightmares themselves were thought to be more than bad dreams. They were night hags pressing on the chest, suffocating sleepers. To ward them off, herbs were scattered around the bed: rue, sage, or rosemary, each thought to repel malign forces. Some monarchs had sprigs of hawthorn hung over their beds, a practice inherited from folk tradition. The bedroom might smell less like luxury perfume and more like a medieval apothecary, but comfort mattered less than protection. Astrological timing added another layer. If a monarch had to travel, advisors might insist he avoid sleeping in strange beds on certain unlucky nights. If unavoidable, charms were doubled. Even the positioning of the bed mattered. Heads pointed north for stability, east for divine blessing. A misplaced headboard could invite misfortune, or so it was believed. And then there were prayers. Monarchs, especially devout ones, whispered litanies before sleep, crossing themselves, murmuring psalms. Sometimes entire choirs sang Compline, the last prayer of the day, outside the chamber, to soothe and sanctify the night. Imagine drifting off not to white noise or a fan, but to an ensemble of monks chanting beneath your window, comforting for some, unsettling for others. The royal bed also bore physical symbols of protection: crosses carved into the wood, embroidered motifs of angels or saints in the canopy, even painted talismans hidden beneath headboards. One French queen reportedly refused to sleep in a bed unless a crucifix was fixed above it. The bedroom itself became a shrine, as much a holy place as a private retreat. Of course, skeptics rolled their eyes. Some courtiers mocked the layering of relics, herbs, and symbols, whispering that the king trusted in lavender more than in armies. Yet the rituals persisted. After all, when assassins and poisons haunted the day, why not fear shadows at night? The royal body was too important to risk, even to invisible forces. Quirky anecdote: in certain German courts, servants placed iron knives under royal mattresses, believing iron repelled witches. Imagine lying on a feather mattress with a dagger tucked beneath you, sleeping peacefully while balancing on a superstition. So as you snuggle into your own bed tonight, free from relics and hawthorn sprigs, remember the monarchs who drifted off under layers of charms and whispered prayers. For them, midnight wasn't quiet. It was an hour of hidden battles against spirits, witches, and nightmares. Their bedrooms glowed not only with candlelight, but with the weight of superstition, as if every shadow had teeth. You wouldn't expect maps to be spread across embroidered sheets, but royal bedrooms often doubled as council chambers when urgency struck. By day, kings ruled from thrones. By night, they sometimes ruled from pillows. The bedroom was intimate, less formal than the audience hall, and that very informality made it dangerous, because decisions whispered at midnight could shape the fate of kingdoms. Picture the scene: a king propped up against a mound of pillows, silk nightshirt slightly askew, candle stubs guttering on a side table. Around him stand generals, ministers, and scribes, their shadows stretching tall against velvet curtains. The bed itself becomes a desk, maps unrolled across blankets, inkpots balanced on trays. You think your boss's Zoom calls at odd hours are intrusive? Try being summoned to debate military strategy while your monarch is literally under the covers. Henry VIII was known to conduct business from bed, especially when gout made walking difficult. Ambassadors sometimes found themselves awkwardly bowing while he lounged in nightclothes, grumbling over treaties between sips of spiced wine. Louis XIV too turned his bedroom into a semi-official office. His famous lever and coucher rituals weren't just about dressing and undressing. They also became times when he received reports, signed decrees, and whispered decisions that reshaped France. Historians still argue whether this blurred boundary was convenience, or a deliberate performance to remind everyone that even in bed, the king reigned. War councils at night carried a special atmosphere. Urgency crackled in the air. Outside, guards kept watch. Inside, quills scratched as generals debated routes and supplies. One quirky tidbit. During the 30 Years' War, Emperor Ferdinand II supposedly kept a portable writing desk by his bed so he could draft orders immediately if struck by inspiration or insomnia. His attendants must have loved being woken at 3 a.m. to copy battle plans by candlelight. Queens also wielded influence here. Catherine de' Medici, widowed yet still powerful, often conferred with advisers in her private chambers. She used the intimacy of the bedroom to disarm and control, luring allies into a softer, more personal space where decisions were sealed in whispers rather than proclamations. The bedroom blurred public and private, turning sheets into negotiation tables. And let's not forget the gossip this produced. Ministers leaving the royal bedchamber at odd hours sparked speculation. Was it political business or something more personal? Rumours swirled, alliances were questioned, reputations tarnished. A candle burning too late behind a monarch's curtains could fuel paranoia across the palace. There's also the odd comedy of logistics. Imagine trying to spread maps across a lumpy feather mattress while the king shifted under the sheets. Wax dripped on vellum, ink smeared when the bed sagged, and dogs curled inconveniently atop crucial regions of the map. Decisions that sent armies marching were sometimes made in these ludicrous circumstances. But behind the humour was real vulnerability. To invite ministers into the bedroom was to expose weakness. A ruler in nightclothes, hair unpowdered, perhaps visibly ill or weary, showed a side never seen in the grand hall. Trusted advisers exploited this intimacy. Some pressed petitions while the monarch yawned, knowing fatigue made him pliable. Others withheld bad news, fearing it would darken already restless nights. So, as you imagine yourself drifting off, picture instead being nudged awake, curtains parted, candles relit. A minister leans over your bed, spreading maps across your knees, urging you to choose a battle plan before dawn. The royal bedroom, far from sanctuary, was often a war room in disguise, where decisions born of sleepless nights rippled outward to shape the lives of thousands. You sink deeper into the imagined sheets, but in royal history, beds weren't just where kings and queens slept, they were often where they died. Royal deaths in bed were as ceremonial as coronations, staged spectacles where the private act of dying became public theatre. The chamber, heavy with incense and whispers, transformed into a stage where the final breath carried political weight. Picture it. The king lies propped on pillows, face pale, breath shallow. Curtains are tied back, not for privacy but for visibility. Courtiers, clergy and family crowd into the chamber, their eyes fixed on the royal body. Dying alone would have been scandalous. A king had to die witnessed, his last moments affirmed by loyal subjects. The bed, once a symbol of intimacy, became a platform where power passed visibly from one generation to the next. Louis XIV's death in 1715 exemplified this. For weeks his chamber was filled with courtiers who shuffled in and out, murmuring prayers, waiting for the inevitable. His physicians hovered constantly, applying ointments, lancing boils, whispering prognosis after prognosis. Servants carried away soiled linens daily, replacing them with fresh embroidered sheets, because even a dying king had to look regal. Historians still argue whether this constant staging was meant to comfort the court or simply to remind them of his enduring majesty. The ritual had a theological dimension too. Priests administered last rites in the bed, anointing the monarch with holy oils. Candles were lit, relics placed nearby, prayers whispered. Death wasn't just personal, it was sacramental, tying the ruler's soul to the divine order. In Catholic courts, entire choirs sometimes sang psalms in the chamber, their voices rising over the rattling breath of the sovereign. Imagine trying to pass quietly while a small orchestra performs bedside. Quirky tidbit. Some monarchs insisted their courtiers continue normal duties in the room, even as they faded. Charles II of England famously told attendants on his deathbed that he was an unconscionable long time dying, ever the performer, even in decline. His chamber was filled with lords, doctors, and clergy, all trying to manage the optics of the king's slow departure. For queens, death in the chamber often came with added symbolism. The bed that bore children also bore the queen herself at life's end. In some cases, queens who died in childbirth were mourned not just as wives or mothers, but as sacrificial figures, their beds draped in black as though transformed into altars. The line between bedroom, birthing room, and deathbed blurred in tragic symmetry. The royal bedchamber itself bore witness to cycles of life and death, birth, consummation, illness, scandal, and eventually the final breath, all unfolded beneath the same canopy. To die in bed was the expected closure, the good death that reassured subjects their monarch had passed peacefully, handing power gracefully to the next. A violent death elsewhere was chaos. A death in bed was order, and yet dying in bed was rarely peaceful. Physicians bickered, courtiers jostled for position, factions whispered about succession, even as the body cooled. The chamber grew crowded, hot, suffocating, filled with the scent of wax, sweat, and incense. Privacy vanished. The monarch, stripped of strength, became a spectacle for those already plotting tomorrow. So as you picture the royal bed now, imagine the heavy hush of a chamber filled with witnesses, the last candlelight flickering across embroidered curtains. A sovereign, once commanding armies, reduced to shallow breaths under perfumed sheets. The royal bedroom, final theatre of rule, where even death was staged as one last performance of power. The monarch's last breath fades, the chamber falls silent. Yet even in death, the royal bed does not rest. The moment the body is carried away, attention turns to the linens, pillows, and sheets. What was once intimate is now relic, treasure, even potential weapon. Stripped sheets became fragments of power, claimed by courtiers, preserved in treasuries, or whispered about in rumor. Imagine attendants carefully folding the final sheets that had touched a king's skin. In some courts they were stored as holy relics infused with the aura of majesty. A monarch was believed to embody divine authority, so objects that had been close to his body, especially in death, were considered charged with sacred weight. Priests sprinkled the linens with holy water, archivists catalogued them, and courtiers vied for scraps. It wasn't just fabric anymore, it was history. In other cases, the sheets became contested spoils. Servants fought for pieces, hoping to keep them as lucky charms or to sell them quietly for profit. One quirky tidbit: after Charles II's death, some attendants allegedly snipped bits of the royal nightshirt as keepsakes. Imagine turning your employer's pajamas into black market souvenirs. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated or genuine glimpses of morbid opportunism. Sheets could also become symbols of scandal. Rumors about what stains they carried, blood, sweat, or other traces, spread quickly. Whispers of poisoning were sometimes proved by pointing to discolorations on linen. Whether true or not, the mere presence of suspicious marks could alter reputations, feeding conspiracy theories long after the monarch was gone. And what of the bed itself? Sometimes it was dismantled, burned, or buried to prevent relic hunters from desecrating it. Other times it was preserved and displayed becoming a macabre tourist attraction for future generations. The so-called deathbed of Louis XIV drew curious visitors eager to see the place where the Sun King dimmed. For them, the sheets were gone, but the wooden frame remained as a ghostly stage. For queens, the stripping of sheets carried different echoes. If a queen died in childbirth, her linens were often burned immediately, considered polluted by death and danger. Yet even then, fragments sometimes escaped, carried off as grim reminders. Nurses, midwives, or maids might hide small corners of cloth, folding tragedy into their aprons. Royal relics of this kind blurred lines between sacred and profane. To touch the sheets was both eerie and awe-inspiring. Some were believed to cure illnesses or bring luck in childbirth. Others were hidden away, feared as cursed. The chambermaids who laundered such linens bore unspoken power, deciding whether they survived or vanished. So the bed, stripped of its sovereign, lingered as an empty monument. Once filled with ceremony, gossip, passion, and fear, it now stood bare, draped only in silence. The absence of the body made the presence of the sheets all the more haunting. They were no longer comfort, but evidence, objects whispering of power's fragility. As you picture yourself tucking into bed tonight, think of the strange fate of royal linens, stroked with reverence, stolen in secret, burned as dangerous or preserved as relics. Cloth meant for sleep transformed into fragments of history, carrying whispers of death into the restless nights of those who kept them. The chamber is hushed now, the monarch gone, the sheets stripped, the air heavy with incense and memory. A single candle flickers in the corner, its flame bending low, casting long shadows across the empty bed. Once, this place had been alive with ceremony, whispers, quarrels, and rituals. Now it is still, yet even in stillness the room speaks. Royal bedrooms were more than spaces for sleep. They were theatres where power was performed, where alliances were forged, where scandals bloomed. Behind the velvet curtains, kings and queens revealed their frailty as much as their majesty. They paced sleeplessly, they laughed with lovers, they schemed over maps, they whispered prayers, they died. Each night carried both vulnerability and spectacle. That final candle, guttering lower, captures the essence of it all. Night after night, centuries of monarchs lay down, convinced the world depended on their rest. They feared assassins in the shadows, poisons on the sheets, omens in their dreams. They clutched relics, sipped draughts, summoned servants, or reached for companions, yet rarely found peace. Their bedrooms were fortresses, prisons, theatres, nurseries, and tombs, all layered into one space. And when the candle finally sputtered out, whether for a night or forever, dynasties shifted. The bed, that supposed sanctuary, became a symbol of continuity or collapse. Curtains drawn open or shut, sheets spread or stripped. Each small act in the bedchamber reverberated across nations. The chamber itself seemed to breathe with history, long after the monarchs who slept there had turned to dust. Now, as you lie in your own bed, in your own quiet chamber, you might feel the weight of those histories pressing gently on the edges of your imagination. But here, unlike there, you are free of ceremony. No courtiers hover, no candles sputter ominously, no treaties wait upon your dreams. Just the soft hum of your space, the steady rhythm of your breath, and the simple gift of solitude. So let the final image fade, a bed draped in silence, the last ember of candlelight trembling, and a dynasty dissolving into memory. You are safe, you are still, and you can let the history rest now. And now the story slows. The curtains in your mind draw gently shut, not heavy with velvet, but soft with calm. The noises of courtiers and whispers of politics recede, leaving only quiet air. You imagine the candle extinguished, smoke curling upward, vanishing into darkness. The room grows softer, lighter, more spacious. No attendants linger, no fears creep through the stone. Only stillness remains. Sheets are not embroidered or perfumed, but plain and comforting, wrapping you in warmth without weight. The bed is no longer a stage, no longer a throne, no longer a site of scrutiny. It is simply a place to rest, to breathe, to let go. You stretch out, muscles loosening, the long journey through centuries fading like echoes in a corridor. Where once you pictured monarchs fretting beneath gilded canopies, you now see yourself, calm, at ease, surrounded by nothing but peace. The ghosts of palaces have retreated. The air is your own again. With each breath, the candlelight dims further. The shadows smooth out, the edges soften. Your body feels heavy in the best way, sinking into the mattress beneath you. Time slows. The history we wandered together drifts away like pages closing gently in a book. Let your thoughts become lighter. Let your shoulders release. Nothing is required of you now. No performance, no witness, no burden. Just rest. The story has ended, the palace has emptied, and you are free to sleep. So let the final words fade like whispers. You are safe, you are warm, and you are enough. Close your eyes, drift into stillness, and let the night carry you toward dreams that belong only to you.